All right, let's continue shedding light on this, and to help us understand the reason behind the devastating floods as well as heavy rains in KwaZulu-Natal, we're now joined by Dr. Tafadzwa Mabhaudhi, or Professor of Climate Change, Food Systems as well as Health in the London School of Hygiene as well as Tropical Medicine. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. So talk to us about, firstly, maybe just help us understand the reason behind the current devastating floods as well as heavy rains in Durban. Let's talk about that. What do you think has led to this phenomenon?
Thank you and good afternoon. So heavy rains are typical in Durban at this time of the year because we are in the thick of summer. So typically we get our heaviest rainfall in December, January and February. And if you recall, even last year, in the previous years, there was flooding last year in January 2024. This time it's occurring now in February. Previously, it's happened again in December or January. So we do receive heavy rainfall in Durban at this time of the year. We receive torrential rainfall at this time of the year, which means thunderstorms. And if there's been heavy rainfall for a prolonged period of time, it usually means the soil is saturated, river levels are going to be high. So the risk of flooding then becomes increased in those instances.
Now, Professor, interestingly, though, is the issue of climate change funding as well as preparations now actually form a key as well as integral part of some discussions like now currently taking place at the G20. It's hot on that particular agenda. I know at the recently held AU summit recently, they also highlighted the need for the continent to better start preparing itself. Yet this is not yet even featured in short-term plans as to how it will then be implemented. I mean, our drainage systems are currently inundated, leading to localized as well as flash flooding in urban areas, even as we saw in Port Shepstone in the south of Durban.
Yeah, so it's a mix of problems and challenges. So climate change on the one hand, and the science is there, it has been shown and proven, is increasing or has already increased the risk of heavy rainfall and flooding in KwaZulu-Natal and the South Coast in particular. And we've been seeing this increasing frequency of floods with varying intensity since around 2017. It's almost been flooding every year in KZN, especially on the South Coast. What we've not been able to do in that entire time is really to come up with proactive measures to mitigate the risk of damage, the risk of loss of life. We've got a mix of challenges. You mentioned poor drainage systems. That is also linked to poor waste management because we're not collecting waste, solid waste, ending up blocking drains. There's also the risk of people moving in and encroaching into environmentally sensitive areas and building houses in steep slopes and below flood plains. And there's also challenges in terms of our disaster management, not being able to issue warnings in advance. As you heard from the briefing there, the mayor saying that, or thanking the councillor for alerting disaster management. Now, that's the opposite way around. It should have been disaster management alerting the community of an imminent disaster, not the community alerting disaster management that something is happening.
You know what I found interesting as well, Professor, is that I'm sure you saw that briefing. Of course, the COGTA team there basically acceding to the fact that some of the tribal land that is allocated to residents, apparently it looks like some proper checks and balances were not actually performed before people were actually allocated to build on those particular parts of the land. So a lot needs to go into this, particularly special planning as well as change of policy as well as other municipal bylaws.
Yeah, indeed. So municipalities need to implement what we call risk-informed urban planning as well as climate-sensitive spatial planning.
Yes.
Climate-sensitive spatial planning will be able to identify those areas that are at risk of flooding, areas that need to be protected because they provide natural buffering capacity and de-risk floods. The risk-informed urban design will be able to improve on drainage and stormwater design. It will also create rechanneling of rivers and deepen rivers in order to take care of additional flows. But when it comes to the issue of tribal land, we have said that there's a need to then train indunas who are responsible for parceling out land within these tribal areas so that they are aware of which areas people can be settled on and which areas need to be protected. So without that information on their hands, they are more likely to continue allocating people land, in areas that are at risk of flooding. So we also need to build the capacity of indunas so that they can perform their role adequately.
Absolutely. And you heard them there, Professor. They're saying they don't have a choice sometimes, because when they try to relocate the affected people to some communities, it's the communities that don't want them to be moved into their neighborhoods. But I mean, Professor, let's then maybe outline a plan of action for the immediate term that government can actually employ to at least mitigate some of these disasters. The president endorsed the Climate Change Act that was actually intended to enable the alignment of policies that influences South Africa's climate change response to ensure a climate change resistant response. But disaster management teams are actually still found wanting.
Yeah, indeed, the Climate Change Act is a step in the right direction, but you must also note that it has not yet been promulgated, which means its actual implementation has not yet started. So we need to move fast to promulgate the Climate Change Act. Its promulgation also rests on increasing climate finance. So we need to unlock the issues of finance. And the numbers involved are quite significant and staggering. Hence the talk at the G20 with regards to access to climate finance and how South Africa and how our cities even should be able to access some of this international climate finance. So the Climate Change Act is progressive. We need to now start implementing it proactively so that we start mitigating these disasters. At the city level and provincial levels, as I said, we need to start implementing risk-informed urban planning and climate-sensitive spatial planning. We also need to implement early warning systems that are community-based so that information gets to people and people's lives and property is not put in danger when we've got these incidents. We also need to work with different partners and sectors, because climate change affects us across sectors, so that we implement multi-sectoral responses. We also need to think, broadly around issues of even mental health and diseases, things that flare up within these disasters. So a multi-sectoral, a multidisciplinary approach is required. Most of these steps are indeed outlined in the Climate Change Act. So I would say a first step is us getting to start implementing the Act.
Absolutely. Professor, thank you so much for that input this afternoon. That is Professor Tafadzwa Mabhaudhi, a climate change expert there, weighing in on the latest climate weather change impact currently in South Africa, particularly in the province of KwaZulu-Natal.